In a cave in northern Spain, 2 fossil teeth told us something about evolution that the 20th century missed. The scratches on the enamel were 500,000 years old. They angled down and to the right. The hand that held the knife was already, even then, the same hand most of us use now, and the rarer hand was already there. 10% of them. 10% of us. Natural selection had every chance to take it. It did not. We will get to those teeth in a moment. First, picture a different place. You are standing at the back of a cave in southern France, somewhere between the Lot River and the limestone valleys above it, and the air keeps the cold of December even in July. The cave is called Pech Merle. The year, if you were keeping count, is roughly 30,000 years before any year you have ever lived in. A torch throws orange light across damp limestone, and the limestone gives the light back, slow and yellow. The walls smell faintly of mineral water and old smoke. Beside you, in the half-dark, a person presses their left hand flat against the wall. Their palm is cool against the rock. Their fingers splay open. The thumb sits a little apart from the others, the way a thumb does when a hand has relaxed against a flat surface. They lift a hollow bone to their lips. The bone is the length of a finger, hollowed and trimmed, and probably belonged, in another life, to a swan or a vulture or a horse. They take a breath. There is a hiss of ochre, a fine red mist that hangs in the torchlight before settling. The pigment is iron oxide, ground on a stone, mixed with water or saliva or fat, and held in the mouth or in a small clay cup until the moment of the breath. When the hand lifts away from the wall, a ghost remains. 5 fingers, 1 palm, a clean negative pressed into the stone. You can see the line where the wrist ended. You can see the small, uneven gap between the index and the middle finger. You are looking at one of the oldest self-portraits in the world, and you are looking, although you do not yet know it, at the answer to a very long question. You can stay here for a while. The cave is patient. The pigment is dry already, or it will be dry by the time you remember to look back at it. The figure who pressed the hand has stepped away from the wall. They are sitting now, somewhere a few paces back from the painted surface, breathing slowly, perhaps a little dizzy from the powder. They are alive, the way you are alive. They have a name they answer to, although you would not be able to pronounce it. And they have, at the end of their right arm, the hand you have just watched do the work. The dominant one, the one that held the bone tube and pushed the air. Here is the question. In 2006, in the journal Antiquity, an archaeologist named Dean Snow looked at 32 stenciled hands across the cave systems of Europe. He measured fingers. He measured palm shape. He measured the relative length of the index finger and the ring finger, the small body clue that anthropologists call the digit ratio, which differs slightly between men and women. He worked out the simple physics of how the stencil is made. Think about it for a moment. You have a hand and a bone and a mouthful of pigment. You want to leave a mark on the wall. You will not, if you have any sense at all, try to hold the bone and blow the pigment with the same hand you are trying to print. You will keep the bone tube in your stronger, more articulate hand. You will keep the palm of your other hand flat against the rock. That is the choice everybody makes. The dominant hand does the precise, controlled work. The non-dominant hand becomes the canvas. So a left-hand stencil means a right-handed artist. A right-hand stencil means a left-handed one. The wall, it turns out, has been keeping a very simple census the whole time. And when Dean Snow counted, he found something very strange. 75%, 80% in some samples. The hands on the wall were, overwhelmingly, the hands of right-handed people, which means that the hands not on the wall, the artists holding the bone tube and the breath and the pigment, were right-handed too, in exactly the same ratio you would find if you walked into any room in any city tonight and counted roughly 9 in 10 right-handed, roughly 1 in 10 left, 30,000 years ago. The same ratio, the same fraction. And Pechmerl was not alone. Snow's method and the methods of those who came after him were applied to other walls. To Chauvet, in the Ardèche, where the painted lions and rhinoceroses are older still, more than 30,000 years before the present. To El Castillo, in the north of Spain, where uranium series dating by Alistair Pike and his colleagues in 2012 pushed the age of some of the hand stencils to more than 40,000 years. Earlier still, the same 9-to-1 ratio, the hands on the wall, the artists at the wall, the breath through the bone. The same percentage of right-handed and left-handed people in caves spread across thousands of kilometers of Europe over a span of time longer than most of recorded history. You think left-handedness is a modern thing. You think it is a quirk of crowded schools and electric lights, or a small developmental hiccup, or maybe just one of those statistical noises in a complicated species. You think, if you grew up in certain places, that schools were right to try to correct it. Or you think, if you grew up in others, that it is a kind of mild novelty, like green eyes or perfect pitch. You think, and this is the gentle assumption underneath all of it, that natural selection works the way you were told it works, which is to say, that it removes what does not help, and keeps what does, and over enough time, the species is left clean. You think the 10% should not really be here. But Dean Snow had just proved that the 10% was already standing in that cave, already pressing their hand against the wall, already mixing the ochre. 500,000 years of selection had passed through, and the ratio had not moved. Why? That is the question we will spend tonight following, slowly, into the dark. We will come back to those Pechmerl hands, and we will come back much later to a pair of researchers in France in 2005 who looked at fencing data and homicide rates and finally explained why the number sits at 10% and not at 1 or 50. We will come back, too, to a paper in 1988 that frightened half the left-handed population of the Western world for almost a decade, before it turned out the paper was wrong and the people in the data were not dying young at all. They had simply been hidden. But first, before any of that, we have to go further back than the cave. We have to go to a pit in the mountains of northern Spain, where a paleoanthropologist looked very, very closely at the teeth of people who lived 500,000 years ago and read the answer in the scratches. You are now somewhere quite different. You are crouched in poor light, very close to a fragment of fossilized jaw. You cannot see what you are looking for with your eyes alone. The scratches are far too small. Only under a scanning electron microscope, with the magnification dialed up and the light angled across the enamel at just the right slope, do the marks resolve into thin diagonal lines. There are dozens of them on each tooth. Each one is the ghost of a single moment, a momentary slip, a stone tool that grazed the enamel 500,000 years ago and was forgotten before the sun went down. The teeth are brown with age. They smell of nothing. And the scratches are unmistakable. The place is called Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. It is at the bottom of a narrow limestone shaft in the Atapuerca hills of northern Spain, a place that has accumulated bone over centuries the way some places accumulate water. To get to it now, you crawl, you squeeze through a passage that was not designed for human shoulders. You drop down into a chamber where the cold is constant and the air smells faintly of clay. The bones at the bottom were laid there, or fell there, or were carried there over a long time by people who looked something like us and something like Neanderthals, and lived around 500,000 years before this sentence. There are at least 28 individuals in the pit: men, women, children, skulls, jaws, ribs, vertebrae, hand bones. The collection is so dense and so deliberately concentrated that some archaeologists think the bones were placed there on purpose, that the shaft was a kind of resting place, a very early gesture of ritual, although nobody can prove that. What is certain is that the people are there and have been there a very long time, and their teeth are mostly intact, and their teeth carry the scratches. You are standing, for a moment, above one of the oldest crowds in the human story. The man who has spent the longest looking at their teeth is a paleoanthropologist named David Freyer, and what Freyer was doing was very simple and very strange and very clever. You have to picture for a moment what these people were doing with their hands. They had stone tools, they had meat, they had hides, which they cleaned and softened by pulling them across their teeth, and they used their mouths as a third hand. You can do this yourself, slowly, if you want. You grip a strip of meat between your front teeth. You pull it taut with one hand. With the other hand, you bring a sharp flint across, towards your face, and you cut the strip free where it leaves the mouth. It is dangerous work. The flint is sharp. Your face is right there, and sometimes the flint slips. When the flint slips, it leaves a scratch on the enamel of the front teeth at a very particular angle. If the stone was held in the right hand, the scratch will run one way. If it was held in the left hand, the scratch will run the other way. The angle is fixed by the geometry of arm and wrist and mouth. The geometry does not lie. You should be honest about how strange this is, as a kind of evidence. It is not the bone of the hand itself. It is not the curl of a finger preserved in some lucky mineralization. It is the residue of an accident, a small slip performed in a routine moment when the only audience was the person who did the slipping. The scratch was not made on purpose. The scratch was not noticed. The scratch was not, in any sense, intended to be a message. And yet, 500,000 years later, it is one of the clearest messages we have from anyone who lived back then. Their carelessness, transcribed onto enamel, talking to us across an unimaginable distance. Freya looked at the teeth from cima de los huesos. He counted angles. He worked out, individual by individual, which hand had held the flint. And the answer was a number you have heard before. About 93% of the people in the pit were right-handed. About 7% were left, 500,000 years ago. The ratio was already there. You can pause on that for a second, because it is doing some quiet work. These people were not yet Homo sapiens. The bones in the pit belong to Homo heidelbergensis and to the earliest Neanderthals, the ancestors and the cousins of our species. The people who would eventually give some of their genes to the modern humans who left Africa and never quite gave them back. They were not us. They had heavier brows and bigger faces and stronger jaws and probably a quieter inner monologue, although nobody can say for certain how quiet. They lived in a world without farming, without writing, without anything you would call a city. And they had the same right-handed bias that you have, the same approximate 1 in 10 left-handed minority among them. It is older than our species. It is older than the way we look in the mirror. You can do something quietly with that number. You can let it sit. The cave at Pechmerl is, in archaeological terms, last week compared to Cima de los Huesos. The Egyptians, the Sumerians, the cities along the Indus, the building of the first temples in Anatolia, all of recorded human history, is a thin film of paint over the top of a much older surface. And on that older surface, where the people did not yet look quite like us, the same ratio was already pressed in. This is not a coincidence. This is a fact about what we are. We will come back in a while to a series of homicide statistics that two French researchers gathered in the Amazon basin, and to the very specific reason that 10% is the exact balance point and not 8 or 12 or 1. But before that, we should walk through one more piece of the evidence, because Cima de los Huesos is not the only place that the deep time of the right hand and the left hand has been read. The stone tools themselves carry it too, across the long technological stretch we call the Acheulean, and the even older stretch before it we call the older one. Our ancestors sat with cores of flint or quartzite or basalt and struck flakes off them with a hammerstone. Every strike leaves a scar. The scar has a direction. The direction encodes the geometry of the strike. Which wrist twisted, which shoulder drove the blow, which side of the body was, in that instant, the one that the toolmaker trusted to do the precise work. When you put a stone flake under a magnifier and look at the ripple on its dorsal surface, you can read the strike. The cone of force tells you where the hammerstone hit. The ripple tells you which way the energy traveled. The lip on the under edge tells you the angle of the wrist. None of this is mysterious once you have learned to look. It is just physics, repeating itself in stone. When archaeologists sit down with a tray of these flakes, and they look at the orientation of the scars across hundreds of pieces from a single site, and then across thousands of pieces from dozens of sites scattered through Africa and Europe and Asia, the picture that comes back is very consistent. The majority is right-handed. The minority is left-handed. The minority is small, but the minority is always there. Always. Not a single site, of the many that have been carefully analyzed, has come back as purely right-handed. The left hand is always in the assemblage, the same percentage, the same persistence, buried in the chips on the workshop floor. You can imagine, for a moment, the workshop. It would not have been a building. It would have been a flat patch of ground near a stream, or near a kill site, or near the mouth of a cave that someone called home for a season. The toolmaker sits down with their back against a rock, or with their legs crossed, or with their work cradled in their lap. They pick up a core, they turn it in their hand. They look for the platform, the angle of stone where a strike will lift a useful flake. They raise the hammerstone. They strike. A flake comes free. They turn the core, and they strike again. By the end of the afternoon, the ground around them is covered in chips, and they hold in their hand a tool, a blade, a scraper, a point. The tool is what they wanted. The chips on the ground are the accident. And it is the chips, not the tool, that tell us 500,000 years later which hand they used. The right-handed napper leaves a particular pattern of debris on the right side of where they were sitting. The left-handed napper leaves the mirror image. Across thousands of sites, the pattern keeps mirroring itself, the same way, in the same proportions. The majority, the small minority, the same ratio that walked into the cave at Pechmerl, the same ratio that left its tooth scratches at Cima de los Huesos. The ratio is the most patient fact in human prehistory. You should understand, slowly, what this implies. 500,000 years is something that the human imagination does not naturally hold. It is, in evolutionary terms, about 25,000 human generations. That is the slow ratchet of selection. 25,000 chances for a trait to be rewarded or punished. 25,000 chances for the children of one kind of person to live or not live, to mate or not mate, to leave their fingerprints in the gene pool or to vanish. If left-handedness imposed a straight, simple survival penalty with no compensating benefit anywhere in the equation, 25,000 generations would have trimmed it down to almost nothing. Selection is very patient and very thorough. Genuinely costly traits do not last that long. A trait that imposes even a small fitness disadvantage, sustained over 25,000 generations, will be pushed to the rarest edge of the population, where new mutations barely keep it in existence at all. But left-handedness is not at that edge. It is at 10%. It is not somewhere down in a fraction of a percent, where the trait flickers in and out by accident. It is sitting, steady, at 1 in 10. Sitting at 1 in 10 in Freya's tooth scratches in the pit of bones. Sitting at 1 in 10 in the Oldowan flake assemblages. Sitting at 1 in 10 on the wall at Peck Merle. Sitting at 1 in 10 in every census you can run today. Something is holding it there. Something is keeping it from slipping away. Something is keeping it also from rising. You should pause on that second part, because most of the way we are taught to think about evolution is one-directional. A trait is good or it is bad. It rises or it falls. The peacock's tail gets bigger because the peahens prefer it. The eyes get sharper because the predators can see further. Selection, we are told, sharpens, and it does. But selection also balances. There are traits in nature that are kept at a steady, non-zero percentage in a population, not because they are unequivocally good and not because they are unequivocally bad, but because their value depends on how many other individuals already have them. The trait does well when it is rare. The trait does badly when it is common. The trait, accordingly, sits at the percentage where its rare advantage exactly equals its everyday cost. That kind of equilibrium has a name, and we will get to that name shortly. For now, just sit with the shape of the idea. Picture a long, slow seesaw. On one side, an advantage that comes from being uncommon. On the other side, a cost that comes from living in a world built mostly for the majority. The seesaw settles at the point where the two sides cancel. The settling point for human-handedness is 10%. The mathematics of 500,000 years has been quietly calibrating that seesaw, and you are, all of you, sitting on it now. The hand you write with, the hand you reach for the cup of water with, the hand that is currently resting somewhere on your blanket, or your pillow, or your chest, that hand has been placed where it is by a piece of arithmetic older than your species. We will get to what that something is. The answer involves the kind of evidence that natural selection prefers to leave in fossil records and bone pits, and not ordinarily in the homicide statistics of living tribes in the Amazon basin. The answer involves a pair of evolutionary biologists named Charlotte Forey and Michelle Raymond, who wrote a paper in 2005 that argued that the hand has been preserved through one of the older and uglier features of human life. The answer also involves, more peacefully, a fencing piste and a Major League Baseball box score, and a clay tennis court in Mallorca where a young man with the wrong dominant hand was being trained at his uncle's insistence to play with the other one. But that is for the next chapter. We are still here, in the cave and the pit, holding the deep time number in both hands. It is worth pausing on the snow study one more time. because the cave wall is not just a confirmation that the ratio was already locked in by the Upper Paleolithic. It is also a confirmation that the ratio was locked in across very different kinds of work. The teeth at Cima de los Huesos record the everyday business of cutting meat and softening hide. The older one and Acheulean cores record the technical, slow business of making the tools that did the cutting, and the cave wall at Pechmerl records something else again. Something that was almost certainly not about food, or shelter, or survival in any direct sense. The hand on the wall was art, or it was prayer, or it was a signature, or it was something we do not have a word for. And the same percentage of right-handed and left-handed people did each of those three things. The same 9-to-1 ratio cut the meat, napped the flint, and pressed the palm against the stone. Whatever was holding the ratio at 10% did not care whether the hand was working or playing or talking to the gods. The ratio held everywhere. You can also begin to see, now, why the question has bothered evolutionary biologists for a long time. A trait that is rare and stable across hundreds of thousands of years and across many different kinds of activity is asking to be explained. It is not an oddity. It is not a glitch. It is not, in the precise technical sense, an accident. A glitch would have drifted away. An accident would not have survived the pit of bones. The left hand is not an accident. It is a polymorphism. It is a stable variant of a species. It is, in the language of population genetics, in equilibrium, which means there is a force keeping the percentage low, and a different force keeping it from going to zero. We will come back to those two forces soon, and we will give them their names. For now, just hold the picture. The hand pressed against the wall at Pechmerl is the same hand that left its scratch on the enamel of a Neanderthal jaw 500,000 years ago. They belong to the same minority. They are the same 10%, and tonight we are going to find out why. 500,000 years, 25,000 generations, and the number barely moved. The ratio in the cave is the ratio in the pit, and the ratio in the pit is the ratio in your living room. The selection has been long and steady, and the answer, whatever it is, has been waiting for a very long time to be told to anyone willing to lie still and listen. So we will keep walking, out of the cave at Pechmerl, out of the shaft at Cima de los Huesos, and into a more recent room, where two researchers in southern France in 2005 sat down with a map of the world and a set of unusual data and worked out, finally, why the left hand never goes away. You can stretch a little here before we go. The cave is the cave. The pit is the pit. The bones are doing what bones do, which is to outlast almost everything. The ochre on the wall at Pechmerl has been dry for 30,000 years now, and will be dry for 30,000 more, if no human ever finds it again. The teeth at Cima de los Huesos have been in their pit for 500,000 years, and most of that time, nobody was looking. The evidence has been waiting very patiently for the people who would know how to read it. David Freyer and Dean Snow and Alistair Pike are part of a small handful of those people. They were not looking for the same thing, at the same time, in the same place, but the answers they brought back fitted together. The teeth and the wall and the flake scars are all saying the same number, 10%, 9-to-1, the split that does not shift. We are going to leave them here for the moment, the carvers and the painters, and the patient teeth in the pit. The Pechmerl artist is sleeping now, in a hollow further into the cave, on a bed of dry leaves. The Neanderthal at Cima de los Huesos is sleeping somewhere we cannot see. The lights have gone out. Outside, in both places, The night is dark in a way we no longer quite have. No glow on the horizon, no engine sound. Only the slow, patient breathing of a species that has been carrying this same 9-to-1 ratio for longer than any of them could imagine. We will pick up the question of why in a moment. Why 10% and not 8 and not 12 and not 0? Why a trait that costs something to its holder in a world built for the majority has been allowed by natural selection to keep its place? The next part of the story is younger. It is set, mostly, in the last few decades, in laboratories and journal articles and large statistical data sets, but it reaches back into a kind of human behavior as old as anything we do. It is, in a word, about fighting, and it begins on a fencing piste with a left-handed opponent and the half-second a right-handed mind takes to understand that everything it knows is arriving from the wrong direction. The piste is 14 meters long and 1.5 meters wide. The lights above it are old, fluorescent, slightly humming, and they cast a flat white onto a strip of metal mesh that has been worn smooth by 1,000 pairs of feet. You are standing at one end of it, in a thick canvas jacket and a wire mask, and the air inside the mask smells of metal and breath. At the other end of the piste is your opponent. The mask makes their face into a grey absence. The salute is short. The blade goes up, then down, en garde. You have been training for this since you were 9 years old. Every drill your coach has ever set, every parry you have ever practiced, every angle of attack you have ever read in the half-second before a touch, all of it has been calibrated for one specific kind of body, a right-handed body, the blade arriving from your left, the chest exposed on the inside line, the wrist twisting one particular way. You can feel the geometry of it in your shoulders before you have moved a muscle, and then the opponent at the other end of the piste lifts their blade with the other hand. The lunge comes. The blade is in the wrong place. The angle is reversed. The line of attack that your body has rehearsed 10,000 times to defend now opens onto your chest from a direction your nervous system has never had to process at full speed. You are not slow. You have not lost the reflex. The reflex is exactly the same as it always was. What has changed is that the reflex is wrong. It is pointing the wrong way. And in the half-second, your brain needs to flip the entire geometry of the encounter to mirror everything. The angle, the foot, the parry, the riposte in that half-second. The blade is on you. The light on the scoring box goes red. Touch. You are right-handed. The opponent is left-handed. And tonight you are going to lose this bout. And then you are going to win the next one. And then you are going to lose the one after that. And somewhere around the 5th bout, you are going to walk off the piste and pull off the mask and sit on the bench beside the lockers and feel, for the first time, what an evolutionary biologist feels when they look at the long line of left hands stretching back through the cave wall and the pit of bones and the homicide rates of the Amazon and the small, persistent 10%. You are going to feel the answer in your shoulders before anyone tells it to you. There is something the rare hand can do, and the something is that it cost the common hand a half-second to understand it. In 2005, in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B, 2 researchers in southern France sat down with a stack of cross-cultural data and gave that half-second its name. The researchers were named Charlotte Faury and Michel Raymond. They worked at the University of Montpellier, and the paper they published is, to this day, the most influential single explanation of why the left hand has never gone away. They called it the fighting hypothesis, and the engine inside it is a thing called negative frequency dependent selection. You can hold that phrase in your mouth for a moment without unpacking it yet. Negative frequency dependent selection. It is one of those phrases that sounds harder than it is. Strip it down and it says something almost ordinary. A trait is useful exactly because it is rare. The rarer the trait, the bigger the advantage of having it. The more common the trait becomes, the smaller the advantage gets. And at some point the advantage shrinks to match the cost, and the system settles. The frequency stops moving. The population locks in. That is the engine. That is what Forey and Raymond were proposing. The left hand is rare because it is useful, and the left hand is useful because it is rare, and the two things are the same statement seen from opposite sides. Pull one of them, and the other moves with it. The 10% is not a number that biology chose. It is the number that fell out when the two pressures balanced. You can sit with that for a moment. You can let the shape of it settle. To see why that is the answer, you have to put down the fencing mask for a moment and walk somewhere older. You walk into a clearing at dusk, in a part of the world where two men are about to fight with clubs, or with stone-tipped spears, or with their hands, and one of them is going to die. You can hear the breath in their chests. There are no rules in the clearing. There is no peace. There is no referee. There is only the angle of the strike and the speed of the response. Almost every man either of them has ever fought has come at them from the right. You can hold that in your head as you watch. The body knows what right looks like the way the body knows what its own breathing sounds like. The opponent's weight shifts in a particular way. The shoulder rolls forward in a particular way. The weapon moves through a particular slice of air, on a particular diagonal, at a particular height. Block, parry, strike, done. And then one day, in that same clearing, you watch one of them face a man who is not built like the others. The shoulder rolls the other way. The weight shifts the other way. The weapon arrives from a slice of air that has not been preloaded into the nervous system at any point in his life. The block goes to the wrong place. The parry catches nothing. The strike comes in clean, into the side of the head, and the world tilts and the world ends. That is the fighting hypothesis. That is the half second that the half second is. You can feel it under your sternum. It is not a sport metaphor that has been borrowed by biology. It is a biological fact that sport has accidentally preserved into the modern world. In a society where you might be killed by another human being, the rarer your wiring, the better your odds. And in that kind of society, the genes for the rare wiring are passed on at a rate slightly higher than the genes for the common wiring, and the percentage of left hands creeps up a fraction with every generation that ends in violence. Forey and Raymond did not just propose the engine, they went and looked for it. They wanted to know whether you could see the engine running in real human populations in the present day, in the form of a relationship between violence and left-handedness. So they pulled cross-cultural data from 8 traditional societies scattered across continents, and they asked one question of each of them. You can picture them at a desk, the maps unrolled, the 8 societies listed in a column. How violent is daily life here? How often does an adult man die at the hand of another man? And what fraction of this population is left-handed? The numbers they came back with are some of the most haunting numbers in evolutionary biology. At the bottom of the scale was a people in West Africa called the Diula. The Diula were farmers, traders, peaceful by reputation, with very low rates of lethal interpersonal violence. The Diula were also, in Forey and Raymond's sample, approximately 3% left-handed. 3. The natural baseline barely held above the floor. At the top of the scale was a people in the Amazon called the Yanomamo. The Yanomamo lived in long bouts of raiding, retaliation, club fighting, and lethal feud. The anthropologist who studied them most famously, Napoleon Chagnon, found that a substantial fraction of adult Yanomamo men died at the hands of other Yanomamo men, and the rate of left-handedness in the Yanomamo, Infori and Raymond sample was approximately 22%, 22, more than double the modern Western baseline, more than 7 times the rate in the Diula. In between those two extremes, the other societies fell almost in a line, not a perfect line. Nothing in human data is ever perfectly anything, but a line clear enough that when you plot it on a graph, you can put your finger on it and trace it from one corner to the other. You can almost feel the line under your fingertip. The more violence in the society, the more left hands in the society. The less violence, the fewer left hands. The relationship was direct. The relationship was visible. The relationship was strong enough that no honest reader of the paper could shrug it off. You have to feel, hear, the kind of evidence that is. It is not laboratory evidence. It is not a controlled experiment. There is no double blind. There is no clinical sample. There is only a small handful of human societies that the modern world had not yet bulldozed into uniformity, and a careful researcher with a clipboard, walking around asking which hand people wrote with and how often somebody got killed in the village last year. And out of that quiet, low-tech, almost embarrassingly simple piece of fieldwork came a number that fits the model. The number that fits the model is what we mean by evidence. The cave wall fits, the teeth in the pit fit, and now the homicide rates in the Amazon fit. You have heard each of these in turn tonight, and you can feel them stacking. The same shape keeps appearing in different places, drawn by different instruments on different scales of time. 500,000 years of Neanderthal teeth, 30,000 years of cave wall stencils, 8 modern traditional societies in a single line on a graph. They all say the same thing. The left hand pays for itself in violence. The rarer it is, the more it pays. The more common it gets, the less it pays. The equilibrium sits at 10% because that is the place where the two curves cross. You can feel a small tug at this point towards a darker question. If the answer is violence, then is the answer that left-handedness is being maintained by something terrible? The instinct is honest, and the answer is interesting. The honest answer is yes, in a way, and also no, in a way. Yes, because in the long deep history of the species, the people who carried the left-handed genes were on average slightly more likely to survive a particular kind of physical encounter that no human society has ever fully avoided. And no, because the engine does not require that the encounter is happening in your own neighborhood this week to you. The engine ran long enough, hard enough, in deep enough time to set the dial. The dial is now set. The dial is 10%. We are still living with the setting. We are not still feeding it new violence to keep it where it is. You can sleep with that. You can sleep with the idea that an old, dark mathematics was once required to produce a small, persistent variation in the species, and that the dark mathematics is no longer required to maintain it. The setting holds because the cost of moving the setting is itself low. There is no urgency in the genome. There is just the quiet arithmetic that the species has been doing for a very long time. Sport gives you the gentler, modern version, the version where nobody dies and the engine keeps running anyway. You look at any interactive combat sport, the kind where you are reading and responding to a living, intelligent opponent at very high speed, and you find the same thing. The left hand is overrepresented, severely, reproducibly, across decades. In elite fencing, The proportion of left-handed competitors at the very top of the sport is approximately 1 in 2, not 1 in 10, 1 in 2. You can sit with that ratio for a moment. Half of the field at a senior international competition fences with the rare wiring. In boxing, the southpaw stance has been a recognized tactical anomaly for as long as the sport has been written about. In tennis, the names tell the story. Jimmy Connors, John McEnroe, Rod Laver, Martina Navratilova, Rafael Nadal, and the Nadal detail is the one worth pausing on. Nadal is naturally right-handed. His uncle, Tony Nadal, who coached him from childhood, made him play tennis with his left hand. He did this on purpose. He did it because he understood, intuitively, the same thing Forey and Raymond would later formalize. The right-handed player's backhand is the weakness. The left-handed cross-court forehand is the weapon that lives in the lane that nobody guards. Tony Nadal weaponized the fighting hypothesis on a clay court in Mallorca before the science had even finished writing the paper. In Major League Baseball, where the encounter is structured and the data is unusually clean, the over-representation is precise enough to count on. You can almost hear a scout counting it off. The general population is about 1 in 10 left-handed. The pool of elite Major League batters is about 1 in 4. The advantage there is partly the half-second of unfamiliar geometry, and partly the simple geometry of the strike zone. The left-handed batter sees the right-handed pitcher's release point on the easier side. The numbers run themselves. The dugouts know. The scouts know. The general managers know. The advantage is real. It is countable, and it lives in the gap between how common a thing is and how rarely it shows up in the encounter. The fighting hypothesis also makes a clean prediction in the other direction. In sports where the encounter is not interactive, where the opponent is not a living, reading opponent, the left-handed advantage should disappear, and it does. In darts, in archery, in golf, in long-distance running, in swimming, in any sport where you are essentially competing against the geometry of a target or against the clock, the proportion of left-handers at the top tracks the proportion in the general population. There is no surprise to weaponize. There is no half-second to steal. The engine is off. The numbers are flat. That is, in its own way, the strongest piece of evidence for the hypothesis. You can take it as the cleanest cut. The advantage exists exactly where the model predicts it should exist, and it disappears exactly where the model predicts it should disappear. The left hand is not, on average, faster or stronger or more coordinated or more skilled. The left hand simply lives in a part of the geometry that the right hand has not learned to defend. When the geometry matters, the left hand wins. When the geometry does not matter, the two hands are the same. Which raises the question that the fighting hypothesis exists to answer. If the left hand wins so often in interactive combat, why is the world not 50% left-handed? Why does the percentage stop at 10? Why not at 20? Why not at 30? Why not, eventually, at every other person? You can almost hear evolution being asked the question. You can almost hear the answer coming back. And the answer, which is the cleanest part of the model, is that the advantage erases itself the more common the trait becomes. You picture, for a moment, a world where 1 in 2 people fenced with the rare wiring. The half-second of surprise is now gone. The right-handed fencer has trained against left-handers as often as against right-handers, because half of every training partner they have ever had has been left-handed. The unfamiliarity is over. The angle of attack is no longer strange. The geometry has been preloaded. the advantage drops to nothing. And in that same 50-50 world, the left hand still pays the small, everyday costs of being misfitted to a world that is still structurally geared for a different wiring. The scissors, the tools, the desks, the machinery, the small extra accident rate, the small extra developmental risk, all of those things stay where they were. The advantage is gone, but the cost is still there. The math now goes the other way. Left-handers become slightly worse off on average. The percentage starts to fall. And as the percentage falls, the surprise comes back. The rarer the left hand gets, the less the right-handed nervous system has trained against it, and the bigger the half-second becomes again. The advantage returns, and the percentage rises, and the surprise erodes, and the percentage falls, and over in the long, slow churn of generations. The system finds the point where the rare advantage exactly balances the everyday cost. That point, in our species, in this body, in this world, is 10%, plus or minus a little, across 500,000 years, across every kind of weather and every kind of weapon and every kind of clearing in every kind of forest. 10%. The number does not move because it cannot move. The mathematics will not let it. You are going to come back later tonight to a question we are not quite ready to ask yet, which is what happens when a culture decides to take a swing at the 10% and tries to drag it to zero by hand. You will sit in a Victorian schoolroom and you will see the wooden rulers, and you will hear about a paper in 1988 that frightened a generation of left-handed people for the wrong reasons. But first, having found the engine, you have to look inside the engine. We have to ask what biological substance the engine is actually running on. We have to ask where, in the body, the left hand is encoded. And the answer, as it turns out, is one of the strangest stories in modern genetics. Because for decades, scientists were certain they were going to find the gene, and what they found instead was that the gene was not there. There were 41 of them, and not one of them was the answer. You should know, going in, what people expected to find. The expectation was very simple. You can hold it in one sentence. The expectation was that hand dominance was going to behave the way eye color behaves, the way blood type behaves, the way the dimple in your chin behaves, a single locus, a handful of alleles, a clean Mendelian inheritance pattern, the kind of trait you could draw on a Punnett square for a high school biology class. Mother right-handed, father left-handed, 3/4 of the children right, 1/4 of the children left, something like that, something tidy. The first hint that handedness was not going to be tidy came out of twin studies in the second half of the 20th century. You can follow the logic in your head as we walk. The logic of a twin study is one of the cleanest pieces of inference in biology. Identical twins share 100% of their DNA. If a trait is genetic, identical twins must share the trait. Eye color, blood type, curly hair, height, mostly. The twins match. The genome decides. For handedness, the twins do not match. Identical twins are concordant for handedness only about 75% of the time. That sounds high until you remember that even with no genetic component at all, two siblings would match by chance more than half the time, simply because 90% of all people are right-handed. The signal in twin data is not zero. It is just much, much smaller than for any of the traits that share a Punnett square. The heritability of handedness across the strongest modern estimates is approximately 25%. You can put that next to other traits to feel how small a number that is. You can almost hold them in your hand together. Height in adult humans, in well-fed populations, is roughly 80% heritable, eye color almost 100%. Measured intelligence, depending on which study and which test, somewhere between 60 and 80%, handedness 25%. The genome loads the gun, the saying goes, and the environment pulls the trigger. For handedness, the gun is barely loaded. Most of the variance is happening somewhere else, somewhere that is not in the inherited sequence of base pairs. For a long stretch of the late 20th century, this did not stop people from looking. It just made the looking harder. The most influential of the lookers was a British psychologist named Chris McManus. McManus published in 1985, and then in much greater depth in his book Right Hand, Left Hand in 2002, a mathematical model called the right shift theory. The right shift theory was, in its way, a thing of mathematical beauty. It said that there were two alleles at a single genetic locus. The first allele, which McManus called D for dextral, pushed development in the direction of right-handedness. The second allele, which he called C for chance, did not push at all. C left the developing brain to flip a coin. A person with two D alleles was almost certainly right-handed. A person with two C alleles was right-handed only about half the time, and left-handed the other half. A person with one of each was somewhere in between. The beauty of the model was that it predicted, with extraordinary accuracy, the actual pattern of inheritance you see in real human families. You can imagine pulling families off a register, one after another, and checking the model against them. Two right-handed parents produce mostly right-handed children, but not exclusively. A right-handed and a left-handed parent produce more left-handed children, but not a majority. Two left-handed parents produce the highest rate of left-handed children, but still less than half. The right shift theory predicted those exact numbers. The right shift theory predicted them better than any other theory in the field. The right shift theory was, mathematically, almost certainly correct. The right shift theory had one problem. Nobody could find the locus. You can feel the problem before it is named. The single gene with two alleles, the D and the C, the elegant, clean Mendelian engine, it was not in the genome. Decades of looking, in laboratories around the world, in candidate gene studies and linkage studies, and family pedigrees, and the locus did not show up. The model was real. The gene was not. The mathematics was correct, and the biology was nowhere to be found. You can pause here and feel the strangeness of that. A model that perfectly predicts a real phenomenon, fitted to real human family data, refined and re-refined across 2 decades, and you turn the genome over, and there is nothing there. No D, no C, no clean Mendelian locus. The model is describing a real pattern, but the pattern is being produced by some other mechanism that the model is not seeing. The map is correct. The territory is something else. The era of single gene hunting did, eventually, produce candidate genes. They just did not produce the gene. You can watch them arrive, one after another, like guests at a long party that never settles. In 2007, a geneticist named Clyde Franks and his colleagues published a paper in Nature Genetics announcing the first plausible left-handedness gene. They called it LRRTM1. The acronym stands for leucine-rich repeat transmembrane neuronal 1, and it is a gene that does something in the brain that has to do with how neurons connect to one another during development. LRRTM1 looked, briefly, like the answer. It was a complicated answer. The same variant that was associated with a small increase in the likelihood of being left-handed was also associated with a small increase in the risk of schizophrenia, not a large increase. not a frightening increase, a small statistical bump, the kind that only shows up in samples of tens of thousands. But the bump was there, and it was real, and the press picked it up and did what the press does. And for a few uncomfortable months in 2007, the public conversation got tangled up in an old, dark association between left-handedness and mental illness that left-handedness had never deserved. The truth, when the dust settled, was much smaller than the headlines. LRRTM1 is one of many genes that contribute, in tiny amounts, to handedness. The schizophrenia link is real but small. The left-handedness link is real but small. LRRTM1 is not the gene. It is a gene, a small contributor in a long polygenic list. In 2013, another candidate appeared. A researcher named William Brandler and his colleagues identified a gene called PCSK6. You can let the name settle. The biology of PCSK6 made even more intuitive sense than the biology of LRRTM1. PCSK6 is one of the genes involved in the developing embryo, in setting up the left-right asymmetry of the body. It is part of the system that decides which side of your chest the heart will sit on, which side the liver will be on, which way the gut will coil. PCSK6 helps build the original left-right axis of the body in the first weeks of development. It made beautiful sense that a gene involved in that ancient, foundational asymmetry might also be involved in the asymmetry of the hands. PCSK6 turned out also to be a small contributor, not the gene, a gene, one small instrument in what was starting to look increasingly like an orchestra. The orchestra became visible, in full, in 2020. You can picture the room where the data lived. The vehicle was a study published using the UK Biobank, one of the largest population-scale genetic databases ever assembled, with samples from hundreds of thousands of people. The lead authors included Clyde Franks again, and Caroline de Covell, and a constellation of collaborators across multiple institutions. They ran what is called a genome-wide association study. The method is conceptually simple, and the result is what broke the back of single-gene thinking forever. You imagine, for a moment, the picture that comes out of a genome-wide association study. It is called a Manhattan plot, because if you draw it correctly, it looks like the skyline of a city. The horizontal axis runs across the entire human genome, from one end to the other, every chromosome lined up in order. The vertical axis is the statistical strength of the association between any given position in the genome and the trait you are studying. Most of the genome is flat. Most positions are not associated with the trait at all. They look like empty lots, but here and there, scattered across the skyline, are towers, genomic locations where the association is strong enough to count. For most traits, you might get a few towers, a handful, sometimes one very tall one. You stand and look. For handedness, in the UK Biobank, the researchers found 41 towers, 41 separate genetic loci, scattered across the chromosomes, each one statistically associated with whether a person was left-handed or right-handed. And here is the part that mattered, the part that ended the search for the gene. None of the 41 towers was tall. Every one of them contributed an almost imperceptible amount to the actual outcome. Each tower added a tiny push, a fraction of a percentage point, to the likelihood of any given person being left-handed. You add up all 41 of them, you add up the entire skyline, and you still only account for a small slice of the total variance in handedness across the population. The 41 towers, taken together, explain less than the 25% heritability that the twin studies had been suggesting for decades. There is no gene. There were never going to be a few genes. There are dozens, possibly hundreds, of genes, each contributing a microscopic fraction, all of them woven into a developmental ballet that no single model can pull apart. You can feel, when you sit with that result, why it took so long to find. The reason a single locus model perfectly predicted the pattern of inheritance, even though the single locus did not exist, is that a polygenic trait with many small contributors will, on average, behave from a distance as though it had one large contributor. The mathematics smooths out. The family inheritance patterns look Mendelian when they are nothing of the kind. The shape of the result is right. The mechanism producing the shape is something else entirely. And the mechanism producing the shape, we now know, is genuinely irreducible. You can let that word settle in your chest. Handedness is the consequence of dozens of small genetic nudges interacting with each other, interacting with the developmental environment of the womb, interacting with random fluctuation in the timing of cell division, in the geometry of early neural folding, in the cascade of hormones, in the wiring of the corpus callosum. The genome contributes, the womb contributes, chance contributes. None of them, alone, is doing most of the work. That is the meaning of polygenic, fully unpacked. You can hold it slowly. It is not just a word that means many genes. It is a word that means a trait whose underlying mechanism is so distributed across so many small contributors that you cannot in principle find the lever you would pull to change it. There is no lever. There is 1,000 small handles, each of which would move the dial by a hair, and most of which interact with each other in ways nobody has fully mapped. You can also see, from here, what this means for any future attempt to engineer the trait out of the population. You can sit with the implication. It means that no such attempt is possible. You cannot edit handedness out of the genome the way you might edit a single gene disorder. There is no single gene. There is no clean target. Even if you knew the position of every one of the 41 loci, and even if you could safely change them all, you would still only have moved the dial by a fraction of the variance. The rest of it lives outside the genome, in the developmental noise of the womb. You cannot edit developmental noise. You cannot CRISPR a coin flip. The left hand is, in a real and quiet sense, beyond the reach of biological control. You can let that be the thought you carry. The species could not select it out across 500,000 years. The genome cannot be edited to remove it across any number of future centuries. The trait is built, by design, to be irreducible. It is the consequence of a kind of biology that does not consent to being simplified. It is, in the technical language, robust. It is, in plainer language, here to stay. You can also begin to see, now, why the question got so interesting in the 1980s, when a different kind of explanation walked onto the field. If the genome was not the answer, and if the womb was where the action had to be happening, then somebody was going to propose a theory about what the womb was actually doing. Somebody was going to look at the prenatal environment and find a single substance, a single hormone, a single elegant explanation, and they were going to build a theory around it that for 20 years would dominate the field of left-handedness research. You will come back to that theory soon, and to the two researchers who proposed it, and to the slow, careful work that took it apart. You will come back to Geschwind and Galaburda, and to the 70-15-15 split that lives inside every left-handed brain, and to the moment when a clean, unifying hypothesis turned out to be too clean and too unifying to be true. But for now, you can sit with the strangeness of what you have heard. You can let it lie in your chest. A trait that has been at 10% for 500,000 years, held there by the mathematics of violence. A trait whose heritability is 25%, lower than almost anything else we measure. A trait whose genetic architecture is 41 loci of microscopic effect, contributing in aggregate to less than the heritability the twin studies predicted. A trait that is irreducible. A trait that is robust. A trait that cannot be selected out and cannot be edited out and cannot be engineered out. The hand on your pillow is the same hand that scratched the Neanderthal tooth and pressed against the cave wall and walked onto the fencing piece tonight. You can feel its weight. It belongs, biologically, to a small, persistent minority that the species has been carrying for as long as anything we would recognize as a species has existed. And the carrying is not an accident. The carrying is a feature. The carrying is what evolution does when there is no single switch to turn. You can feel, just now, the bone behind your ear, the soft curve of the skull where it meets the neck. You can feel, if you let your attention go quietly inward, the asymmetry of your own head, the slight difference between one side and the other. The brain inside the skull is asymmetric too. The architecture of language, the architecture of motion, the architecture of attention, the whole organ sitting on top of the spine is not the same on both sides. It was never going to be the same on both sides. It is built from the first folds of the embryo to be slightly different from itself. And the difference between the two sides is where, in the next part of the story, the answer to a much older question about the human mind has been waiting all along. You can hold that asymmetry there for a moment. The bone behind the ear, the slight difference between one side of the skull and the other. The brain inside is doing the same thing on a larger scale, and it has been doing it from the first folds of the embryo. You can let your attention settle inside the head. You can imagine, if it helps, a small triangular plateau of cortex on the upper surface of the temporal lobe, just where the side of your head meets the curve above your ear. It has a name. It is called the planum temporal. In the language of neuroanatomy, that means simply the flat plane of the temple. And in most human brains, the planum temporal on the left side is visibly, measurably larger than the planum temporal on the right. You can stay with that for a moment. The plane on the left is bigger than the plane on the right. The brain you are carrying around all day is not a symmetric organ. You knew this already, in a vague way, from the old shorthand about left brain and right brain. But the shorthand was not quite the truth. The truth is that the asymmetry is real, and it is structural, and it was first mapped in a paper published in 1968 in the journal Science by two researchers named Norman Geschwind and Walter Levitsky. They took 100 adult brains at autopsy. They measured the planum temporal on each side. In 65 of those 100 brains, the left was significantly larger than the right. In 11 of them, the right was larger than the left. The rest were roughly equal. The number nobody could shake afterwards was 65 out of 100. A clear majority, a reliable asymmetry, a brain that is not symmetric, by design. You can let that idea sit for a while, then you can let the next one in, because the place where the planum temporal is bigger, on the left side of most human heads, is the place where language lives. The architecture has a name. It has, in fact, two names, each attached to a man who found it. There is Broca's area, in the frontal lobe of the left hemisphere, where the production of speech is organized. There is Wernicke's area, behind it, in the temporal lobe of the left hemisphere, where the comprehension of speech is organized. These are not metaphors. These are physical zones of cortex, a few cubic centimeters each, where damage from a stroke or a tumor produces specific and predictable language failures. Damage to Broca's area, and you can understand speech, but you cannot generate it. Damage to Wernicke's area, and you can speak fluently in sentences that make no sense. You can feel, just now, the way your own mouth would form a word if you wanted to. The intention is in there somewhere. The pathway from the intention to the muscles of the lips and the tongue runs through Broca's area on the left side of your head. And for the overwhelming majority of right-handed people, this is true. The number from the literature is striking. Roughly 95% of right-handed people process language in the left hemisphere of the brain. It is one of the most uniform findings in human neuroscience. The right-handed brain is, almost without exception, left language dominant. You can sit with that uniformity, and then you can think about what happens when neurologists turn the same question on the brain of a left-handed person. Because here, the architecture stops being uniform. Here, the brain starts behaving more like a population than a template. The numbers, drawn from decades of clinical mapping, settle into a kind of three-part split that anyone who studies the field comes to know by heart. 70-15-15. 70% of left-handers, despite their right hemisphere dominance for the hand, still process language in the left hemisphere of the brain, exactly like the right-handers. 15% process it in the right hemisphere, and the remaining 15% are bilateral, meaning the linguistic hardware is spread, sometimes evenly, sometimes patchily, across both sides of the head. You can take a slow breath in. You can let the implication of that arrive at its own pace, because what it means, quietly, is that the left-handed brain is not the mirror image of the right-handed brain. It is something stranger. It is a brain that has, in 7 cases out of 10, the same dominant hemisphere for language as the right-handed brain. The left hand is run by the right hemisphere. The mouth, in most lefties, is still run by the left. The two sides of the body are governed by opposite sides of the brain. There is a crossover wired into the floor plan, and that crossover is part of why brain laterality is so much harder to model than it looks. You can let the lab around you take shape now. You are no longer inside the cave. You are in a hospital corridor, in a teaching hospital, late afternoon, the kind of corridor where one wall is windows and the other wall is doors that do not have names on them. The light is the color of weak tea. There is a patient on a wheeled bed, conscious, calm, prepared. Beside the bed, there is a neurologist with a clipboard. The patient is about to undergo a procedure called the WADA test. It is named for the neurologist who developed it in the 1940s, a Japanese-Canadian physician named Jun Atsushi Wada, who worked for most of his career at the Montreal Neurological Institute. The test is unpleasant. It is also one of the most direct ways human medicine has ever found to locate language inside a living brain. You can watch the procedure unfold slowly. A catheter is fed up through an artery in the leg all the way up to the internal carotid artery on one side of the neck. The catheter delivers a small dose of a barbiturate called sodium amobarbital. The drug travels directly into one hemisphere of the brain. The effect is immediate. That half of the brain falls asleep for a few minutes. The other half stays awake. The patient is asked to count. The patient is asked to name objects. If language was housed in the sleeping hemisphere, the patient will fall silent or speak in nonsense. If language was housed in the awake hemisphere, the patient will keep counting, keep naming, keep producing words. The neurologist watches. The neurologist marks the chart. Then the drug wears off, and the test is repeated on the other side. You can imagine the bed beside the windows, the quiet voice of the neurologist, the small, clear pulse of the patient counting 1, 2, 3, 4, until the count stops and the silence tells the room exactly which hemisphere holds the language. The WADA test is normally administered before brain surgery, when a surgeon needs to know which side to avoid, and it has been administered to thousands of patients across the world since the late 1950s, and the data those patients have left behind is one of the largest natural experiments ever conducted on the lateralization of the brain. The results, gathered up and read against the question of handedness, line up almost exactly with the 70-15-15 split. Right-handers count almost uniformly through one side and fall silent through the other. Left-handers count through one side sometimes, through the other side sometimes, and through both sides sometimes. The variation is real. The diversity is wired into the floor plan of the lefty brain. You can step back from the corridor now. You can let the bed and the catheter and the clipboard fade. The point of that scene is small and important. The left-handed brain is not less lateralized than the right-handed brain on average. It is just less uniformly lateralized. The same species, different floor plans. A population of brains that does not converge on one architecture. And the question that hung over the field of neuroscience for most of the 20th century was the same question that hung over the genetics. What, exactly, was producing this variety? If the genome was not the answer, what was? You can return now to the moment when somebody thought they had it. The year is 1985. The journal is the Archives of Neurology. The two authors are Norman Geschwind, the same Geschwind who had measured the planum temporale 17 years earlier, and a younger neuroanatomist at Harvard named Albert Galaberda. They published a 3-part paper. It would, between 1985 and the end of the decade, become one of the most cited theories in the developmental neuroscience of handedness. It was bold. It was elegant. It accounted for several puzzling facts at once, and, over the following 20 years, it would be slowly and carefully taken apart. The theory ran like this. Inside the womb, the fetal brain develops in two halves, and the two halves develop at slightly different rates. Geschwind and Galaberda proposed that in some pregnancies, the level of testosterone in the intrauterine environment runs unusually high. The high testosterone, they argued, retards the growth of the left hemisphere of the developing fetal brain. The right hemisphere, freed from its usual competition, grows more vigorously and takes on dominance. A right hemisphere dominant brain produces a left-handed child. You can see why the theory caught on. You can feel the mechanical neatness of it. It had a substance testosterone. It had a direction left hemisphere retarded, right hemisphere unleashed. It had a prediction more boys should be left-handed than girls, which is observed. And it had an extension. Geschwind and Galaberda argued that the same testosterone bath would also affect the developing immune system, predicting that left-handers should suffer higher rates of autoimmune disorders, of dyslexia, of stuttering, of autism. They called the syndrome pathological left-handedness, a unified theory of the lefty brain. You can imagine the impact. For most of the 1980s and into the 1990s, the Geschwind-Galaberda hypothesis dominated the field. You would have found it in textbooks. You would have found it in popular science. You would have heard it used to explain everything from why so many great artists are left-handed to why some children stutter. And then, slowly, the dismantling began. In 1990, the British psychologist Phil Bryden and his collaborator Marion Annett began publishing meta-analyses, gathering up the dozens of small studies that had tested the hypothesis. The pattern, when the studies were combined, was not the pattern Geschwind and Galaboda had predicted. You can guess what happened next. The supposedly robust link between left-handedness and autoimmune disorders turned out to be, in the aggregate, weak. In some analyses, you could not find it at all. In the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Chris McManus, the same McManus of the right shift theory, ran further meta-analyses and confirmed what Bryden had begun to show. The clinical pillars of the Geschwind-Galaboda framework were sagging. You can let that sag settle in your mind. A theory that had explained so much was now explaining less. The next blow came from the digit ratio literature. There is a measurement that comes up again and again in the study of prenatal hormones. It is the ratio between the length of the index finger and the length of the ring finger on the same hand, called 2D to 4D. The literature, building from work by John Manning in the 1990s, had established that the digit ratio is shaped, in some part, by the level of testosterone the fetus is exposed to in the womb. Higher prenatal testosterone tends to produce a longer ring finger relative to the index finger. If Geschwind and Galaboda were right, and if left-handers had been bathed in unusually high prenatal testosterone, then left-handers should consistently show a longer ring finger relative to the index. Studies were run. The results were mixed. Some studies found the predicted pattern. Some studies found the opposite. Some studies, when you read them, found no pattern at all. The mixed findings were not a refutation, exactly, but they were the kind of muddy, inconclusive result that no clean master switch theory can survive for long. By the early 2000s, the consensus had shifted. Prenatal hormones probably do contribute something to the lateralization of the developing brain. The womb is not a neutral environment, but testosterone is not the single master switch. You can let the clean unified theory go. The clean sweeping unified theory had been replaced by a quieter, less satisfying answer. The intrauterine environment is chaotic. Many factors push in many directions. Some of them are hormones, some of them are vascular, some of them are mechanical, some of them are, frankly, random. The brain that emerges at birth is the cumulative product of all of them, and this, in the end, is the same answer the genetics arrived at by a different route. Many small inputs, no single switch, a robust trait built out of 100 unstable pieces. You can also, while you lie there, sit with one small final detail from inside the brain, which sleep researchers sometimes find pleasant to think about at this hour. It is the corpus callosum. You have one. It is the thick cable of white matter that runs between the two hemispheres, joining them, carrying signals from one side of your brain to the other. Studies through the 1980s and 1990s by researchers including Sandra Whittleson at McMaster suggested that the corpus callosum is, on average, slightly larger in left-handers than in right-handers. The effect is small. The replications have been inconsistent, but the direction of the effect, where it has shown up, is interesting. A slightly thicker cable, slightly more bandwidth between the two halves of the brain. The lefty brain, in this picture, talks to itself a little more than the righty brain does. Whether that translates into anything we can measure in behavior is, honestly, still an open question. The effect sizes in cognitive testing are tiny when they appear at all. The legend of the more creative left-hander floats just above the actual data, never quite landing on it. You can think, for a moment, of Leonardo da Vinci. You can think of the Codex Atlanticus and the Madrid codices, his notebooks, his thousands of pages of sketches and engineering diagrams and anatomical studies, written from right to left in mirror script. He wrote that way, almost certainly, because he was left-handed, and writing from right to left allowed his left hand to move across the page without dragging through the wet ink behind it. A simple mechanical solution to a simple mechanical problem. The most famous left-hander in the history of the species solved a writing problem by inverting the entire script. You have to hold the notebooks up to a mirror to read them. You can hold that image, the hand moving right to left across the page, leaving dry pigment behind it, leaving 500 years of mirror writing behind it, the hand on the page doing what the brain on the other side of the head asked it to do. You can leave the planum temporale and the vada corridor and the corpus callosum behind now. You can come back, slowly, to the surface of the story, because there is one more chapter to walk through before the night ends, and it is the strangest chapter of all. It is the chapter where the genome failed to eliminate the left hand, and the womb failed to reliably produce it, and somebody, somewhere in human history, decided it was time to try a more direct approach. The biological story, for all its 41 genes and its prenatal noise and its 70-15-15 split, ends with a kind of awe at how stable the trait is. The cultural story, by contrast, ends with a kind of grief at how hard humans tried to make the trait go away. And the cultural story begins, like so much else in the Western mind, with the Latin language and with the words it left behind for the right hand and for the left. You can imagine yourself in a small room with a wooden desk and a hard chair and a Latin primer open in front of you. The page is yellow, the light is low. The two words sit on the page, side by side, like a pair of doors you are about to walk through. Dexter, sinister, the right and the left. You can say them out loud, slowly, in the quiet of your own room. Dexter, sinister. And you can feel, as you say them, the long fall of meaning each one has accumulated over 2,000 years. Dexter, in classical Latin, meant simply the right side, the right hand, the right direction. From it, English inherited the word dexterity, the word you reach for when you mean skill, deftness, accuracy of the hand. The same root gave you the word adroit, by way of French, which in turn comes from the French word droit, meaning right, both in the directional sense and in the legal sense, the sense of correctness, of law, of what is owed and what is just. The right side, in the deep grammar of the Romance languages, is the side of skill, the side of law, the side of being correctly oriented in the world. Sinister, in classical Latin, also meant simply the left side, the left hand, the left direction, but by the late Roman period, the word had already begun to mutate. Roman augurs, the priests who read the flights of birds for omens, faced south when they made their observations. The east, where the sun rose, was on their left. In the Greek tradition, the left was the lucky side because the east was on the left. In the Roman tradition, the augurs adopted the Greek orientation in some passages and reversed it in others, and the word sinister, sitting at the cultural seam between two omen systems, began to take on the weight of unluck, of ill fortune, of the wrong direction. By the time the word entered the Romance languages, and then English, the directional meaning had largely fallen away. and the moral meaning had taken over. Sinister, in modern English, no longer means left. It means malicious. It means evil. It means foreboding. The fossil of the hand is still inside the word, but the hand has been buried under centuries of moral sediment. You use the word now, and you do not even hear the left hand inside it. You can do the same exercise, gently, with French, droit on the right, gauche on the left. Droit means correct, lawful, upright. Gauche means clumsy, awkward, socially unfortunate. The word gauche has crossed into English unchanged, and you now use it in English to mean someone who has said the wrong thing at a dinner party. The grammar of the French language buried the left hand inside an adjective for social embarrassment, and that adjective then crossed the channel and made itself at home in English. And if you use it today, the chances are you have no idea that the original meaning was simply the left. The hand had been encoded as defective inside the deep grammar of Western language long before any schoolmaster ever raised a ruler. You can sit for a moment with the strangeness of that. The languages you have inherited, the ones you use to think with, came preloaded with a verdict on the left hand. Before any child was ever born into those languages, the verdict had been delivered. The right hand was the hand of skill, of law, of correctness. The left hand was the hand of clumsiness, of awkwardness, of menace. The morality came first. The biology had to live underneath it. You can let the Latin desk fade now. You can let the next room come into focus. You can place yourself, just briefly, in a wood-paneled medieval church with a fresco on the wall above the altar. The fresco is the scene from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. At the center of the fresco is the figure of Christ, returned in judgment. To his right are the righteous, the sheep, the saved, lined up in calm and confident postures. To his left are the damned, the goats, the lost, being driven down into a red mouth at the corner of the fresco where the painter has put hell, the right hand of God, the left side of the damned. The image was painted in versions like this, in church after church, across Europe, for 1,000 years. Wherever you walked into a medieval church, you saw it. The architecture of salvation had a right side and a wrong side, and the wrong side was the left. You can imagine, then, what the medieval village did with that imagery, the whispered theology that filled the gaps between the painted images. The folk belief that the devil baptized his followers with his left hand, the catechism that taught children to make the sign of the cross with the right, never the left. The slow accretion of the idea that to favor the left hand was, in some quiet way, to side with the wrong half of the cosmos. By the time the early modern witch trials began, in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, the cultural ground had been seeded for a long time. The inquisitors who traveled from village to village, looking for evidence of pacts with the devil, brought a checklist with them. The checklist had on it the so-called devil's mark, a physical sign on the body of the accused by which the devil was said to have claimed her. The checklist also had, in many regions and many trials, an attentive note about which hand the accused used. A woman who reached, by habit, for the cooking pot with her left hand was not always condemned, but the gesture was logged. The gesture entered the record. The gesture became, in some prosecutions, evidence, not metaphor. Actual evidence used to bring a charge that could end in fire. You can lie still with that for a moment. The historical record is uneven on how often left-handedness, on its own, was the basis for a witchcraft conviction. The trials varied wildly by region. The accusations were always tangled with the local politics of who owed money to whom, and which neighbor disliked which neighbor, and which midwife had been at which difficult birth. But the hand was in the record. The left hand made the woman more suspect, not less. A trait that 10% of the village population carried, naturally and quietly, from birth, had become a marker in the worst kind of trial Europe had yet invented. You can move forward in time now, into the 19th century, and the room around you can change one more time. The witch trials are mostly over. The fresco of the sheep and the goats is now in a museum. The cultural pressure on the left hand has not gone away. It has just changed its uniform. It is now wearing the clothes of a school teacher. You can place yourself, 8 years old, at a wooden desk in a Victorian classroom. The desk has an inkwell. The pen is steel-nibbed. The page in front of you is lined paper. The teacher is moving slowly between the rows of desks, watching every child's hand. Your left hand, the one you have always reached with, has been pulled gently behind your back and tied there with a strip of cloth. The pen is in your right hand. Your right wrist does not know this angle. The ink blots. The letters lean the wrong way. The teacher reaches your desk. The teacher rests a thin wooden ruler on the back of your right hand. The teacher does not say anything yet. You can stay in that desk for as long as it takes. The story of the Victorian schoolroom is the story of an industrial-scale program to convert left-handed children into right-handed adults, and the program ran with varying degrees of cruelty across most of Europe and most of North America for the better part of 100 years. The instrument that mattered most in the American version of the program was a handwriting system introduced in the 1890s by a man named Austin Norman Palmer. The Palmer method, as it came to be called, was published in his 1894 Manual on Business Writing. It became, in the early 20th century, the dominant handwriting instruction system in American public schools, and it stayed dominant well into the 1920s and beyond. The method was elegant on paper. It used the muscles of the upper arm rather than the fingers. It produced a clean, consistent, businesslike script. It demanded a specific posture. The paper had to be tilted at a specific angle. The arm had to move along a specific track, and the entire system was designed, without apology, for a right-handed child. A left-handed child following the Palmer method had to invert the entire mechanics of the wrist, which produced, in most cases, smeared ink, slanted letters in the wrong direction, and a wrist that ached for hours afterwards. You can imagine the schoolrooms, the rulers tapping the wrong wrist, the cloth strips wrapping the wrong hand behind the wrong back, the children whose handwriting was punished, whose grades fell, whose ears were boxed, whose hands were tied. The discipline was not uniform across every school. It varied by teacher, by region, by religion, by decade. But across the early 20th century, in the United Kingdom, and in the United States, and in much of continental Europe, and in many of the Catholic parochial schools that maintained the practice longest, the basic policy was the same. A left-handed child was to be made right-handed by whatever pressure was available. The aim was uniformity. The aim was order. The aim was a classroom in which every wrist, including yours, moved in the same direction. You can sit with the cost of that program. The cost showed up in handwriting, of course. Generations of force switchers grew into adults whose handwriting was permanently dysfunctional, whose grip was wrong, whose letters never quite settled. The cost also showed up in the brain, in ways that are harder to quantify, but easier to feel. Because the production of speech and the production of fine motor control are entangled in the brain's lateralization. When you force a child to switch the hand they write with, you are forcing a renegotiation across the corpus callosum. You are forcing the hemispheres to argue about which one is supposed to be in charge. The argument shows up, statistically, as stuttering, as speech impediments, as writing dysfunctions that last a lifetime. The clinical literature on forced switches is small and sad. You can read it if you want. The brain does not always recover. The biology does not always forgive the culture for what it was told to do. You can now think about the number. The number is the one McManus and others traced through the British archives, year by year, school by school, decade by decade. In 1900, the recorded rate of left-handedness in the United Kingdom was approximately 3%. By 1950, it had climbed to approximately 7%. By 1980, it had peaked and plateaued at approximately 11%. The biology had not changed. The genome had not changed. The 41 loci had not been rearranged. The womb was the same womb. The only thing that changed across those 80 years was the suppression. The suppression collapsed in the middle of the 20th century, mostly in the 1950s and 1960s, and as it collapsed, the ghost lefties walked out of the statistical shadows. They had been there the whole time. They had been suppressed. They had been forced to identify on the school form and the census form and the workplace form as right-handed. When the pressure lifted, the true rate emerged. 11%, almost exactly the rate Dean Snow had measured on the cave walls, almost exactly the rate David Freyer had measured on the Neanderthal teeth. The species had always been at 10 or 11%. The Western world spent the early 20th century pretending it was at 3. You can let that one final number sit in the dark for a while. 3% in 1900, 11% in 1980. The number had moved by 8 points in 80 years, not because anything biological had changed, but because the cultural foot had been lifted off the trait. And it is this gap, this slow 8-point recovery, that explains, more than anything else, the strangest paper in the entire history of left-handedness research. The paper that frightened the world for a decade. You may have heard of it, somewhere, even if you do not remember where. You can place yourself, just briefly, in a lecture hall in 1988. The university is California State University, San Bernardino. The two researchers are Diane Halpin, a psychologist, and Stanley Coren, also a psychologist. They have just published, in the journal Nature, a paper that will become one of the most widely reported pieces of left-handedness research of the late 20th century. The paper's claim, in plain language, was this: left-handers, in their data, were dying nearly 9 years younger than right-handers. The mean age of death for right-handers in their sample was around 75. The mean age of death for left-handers in their sample was around 66. The paper was reported on the evening news. The wires picked it up. The story ran in newspapers across the world. For most of a decade, left-handed people lived with the quiet, low-level fear that they were, in some unspoken biological way, on a shorter clock. You can stay in that lecture hall for a moment. You can see why people believed it. The paper looked rigorous. The journal was Nature, the most prestigious general science journal in the world. The sample size was reasonable. The mortality gap was nearly a decade. And then, over the next few years, a slow and patient unwinding began, and the unwinding ended with the recognition that the entire mortality gap was a statistical ghost. The methodology had been undone by the same cultural arc you have just walked through. You can let the unwinding arrive piece by piece. Halpern and COULDN had drawn their data, in part, from death records. They had looked at the death certificates of people who had died in the 1980s. They had asked the families of the deceased which hand the deceased had used. From those answers, they had built the sample of left-handers and right-handers from which the mortality gap was calculated. The flaw in the method, once you see it, is unmistakable. The people dying in the 1980s were old. They had been born in the 1900s, or in the 1910s, or in the 1920s. They had grown up in the world where left-handedness was actively suppressed in school. You can already see where this is going. The people dying in the 1980s had, in many cases, been forced into right-handed compliance as children. They had identified, by the time they died, as right-handed, and the families, asked which hand the deceased had used, gave the answer the deceased had given them all their lives, right-handed. The cohort effect, as it is called, did not actually make left-handers die younger. It made the left-handers who reached old age look artificially scarce in the sample. The lefties of that generation had been converted, on paper and in the family memory, into righties. So when Halpern and COULDN counted the older deaths, the lefties were missing. They had not died younger. They had been hiding in the data. The mortality gap was an artifact of the same cultural suppression that had pushed the recorded rate from 11% down to 3% at the start of the century. The suppression had distorted the death records as thoroughly as it had distorted the school records. The paper was wrong, not because the numbers in it were forged, but because the world the numbers came from had been forging itself for 100 years. You can let the lecture hall fade. The decade of fear that followed the Halpern-COULDN paper was, in the end, a decade of grieving a death that had not happened. Left-handers do not die younger. The trait does not shorten the life. The trait was hiding in the data because the species had spent a century trying to make it disappear, and the data still bore the marks of the campaign. The campaign failed. The data was wrong. The lives were the same length they had always been. You can come up, slowly, out of all of it now, out of the Latin grammar, out of the witch trial, out of the wooden desk in the Victorian schoolroom, out of the lecture hall in 1988. The room around you is quiet. The night is doing what the night does. The hand on the pillow is the hand it has always been. The trait has been at 10% for 500,000 years. The selection could not take it. The mathematics held it in place against 25,000 human generations of pressure. The culture, when biology gave up, decided it would try to do what selection had failed to do. The culture spent 2,000 years insulting the left hand in language, painting it on the wrong side of the parable, accusing it in the witch trials, tying it behind the back in the schoolroom, hiding it in the census, hiding it in the death certificate. And still, in the year 1980, when the pressure finally lifted, the species walked back to the same number it had carried in the cave at Pech Merle, 11%, 3 points lower than the cima de los huesos teeth. Within range, within the band the mathematics of survival had drawn around the trait 500,000 years ago and never let go. You can feel, just now, the blanket on top of you. You can feel the give of the pillow under your head. The bed under your back is solid. The room is dark. The window is closed or it is open, and either is fine. Outside, the world is doing what it does without you for the next several hours. The species is sleeping in tens of millions of small rooms tonight. About 1 in 10 of those species, in those rooms, is sleeping with the left hand on the pillow. The other 9 are sleeping with the right. The ratio is the same ratio that Freya measured on the teeth, the same ratio Snow measured on the cave wall. The same ratio Forey and Raymond watched, holding the fencing piece together. The same ratio the genome could not move, and the womb could not pin down, and the culture could not erase. The hand you fall asleep with tonight is the same hand that scratched the Neanderthal tooth, that pressed against the limestone, that stenciled the wall. The same hand that napped the flint and held the torch and walked into the dark. It is the hand of a small, persistent minority, or it is the hand of a large, persistent majority. And either way, the body it is attached to was built by 500,000 years of a balance the species could not lose. You belong, biologically, to that balance. You belong to the result of an experiment in diversity that ran for longer than any agricultural civilization, longer than any written language, longer than any of the religions that ever decided which hand was the correct one to baptize with. The night is dark and very quiet. The torch in the cave at Pechmer went out a long time ago. The hand on the wall dried into the pigment and stayed there for 30,000 years. The Neanderthal who slept in the back of the Cima de los Huesos slept in a darkness deeper than this one. The artist at Chauvet carried the torch home, ate, lay down, slept. The trait carried them, and it carried their grandchildren, and it carried their grandchildren's grandchildren, all the way down the long inheritance to this room, to this bed, to this pillow. You can let the breath go now. You can let it out slowly. The diversity itself was selected. That is the answer. The story has been moving toward all night. The minority is not a bug. The minority is the equilibrium. The 10% is the stable point of a long, deep mathematics. And the mathematics does not require that you understand it for it to keep holding. It has been holding without anyone watching for 500,000 years. It will hold again tonight. While you sleep, the hand will rest. The brain will run its asymmetric architecture without your help. The night will be long and very quiet, and you will be in it. 1 in 10 still writing with the other hand. The mathematics held. The night is long. Rest now.